God, how am I going to top that? Thank you so much for being here and listening to me. Before I begin formally with my talk, I just want to make sure that everyone's aware of the disclaimer. All the opinions, views, and everything that's going to be expressed in this talk are all mine. And they're not represented by, representing the views of the Department of Defense and its affiliate, the Defense POW MIA Accounting Agency. I just want to make that clear. So let's just move on to the presentation. So as Professor McCoy has mentioned, I've worked as initially a postdoc and then now a contractor with the DPAA. And what you're going to be hearing about will be a combination of the historical narratives of the Philippine Scouts and finding the missing, as well as my actual work. So without further ado, let's begin with how many exactly are we looking for? Currently, So currently we have about 11,000 missing just in the Philippines, and we're looking at a total of 72,000 worldwide. This is just for World War II. We also have a team for Korean War and Vietnam War, and those are much less than what we're actually dealing with. So you can see the undone, a massive task of finding 70,000+ people, and we're talking about 80 years of just waiting. And so what I want to be focusing on this particular talk will be the 4,600 Filipinos, or specifically 4,300 Filipinos, which are considered as Philippine Scouts. I will be talking about, one will be the common challenges usually encountered when dealing with trying to find missing servicemen, and that will be Americans and Filipinos in the Philippines. But specifically, I will be focusing on later the unique challenges faced when dealing with Philippine Scouts, just because of the actual nature of that organization or that institution, which basically complicated the already complicated task that we're facing. So I will begin with the brief history of the Philippine Scouts. So the Philippine Scouts basically started as being recruited by the U.S. Army to fight, insurgents or nationalists in the Philippines during the Phil-American War. And at that time, the Filipinos were just considered as regular scouts. They're not officially part of the U.S. Army. But in 1901, that completely changed. The U.S. Congress actually gave the president the authority to enlist, recruit, and actually induct Filipinos into the U.S. regular army. What that means is that the benefits, everything that supposed to be given to American members of the U.S. Army should be also given to Filipino members of the Philippine Scouts. And that is, I think, I'd like you to focus on that particular part when I talk to the actual finding of the missing of the Philippine Scouts. And also, again, just a quick point of that, in terms of, for example, pay, basic pay of enlisted men, Filipinos were given 1/3 of the actual pay usually given to the regular army enlisted men. So the discrepancy is clearly there, even though it's already stated, by the Congress that they should be equal to the U.S. Army enlisted men. So for anyone who's not completely familiar with Philippines during World War II. This is just a very, very quick overview of what happened during that time. So right after the attack, the Philippine campaign started, which basically headed by General MacArthur and his USAPE force, comprised of Americans and Filipinos. And when I say Filipinos here, there are actually two groups of Filipinos. One is the Philippine Army under the Commonwealth of the Philippines, which is Commonwealth of the Philippines only means that it's basically still under American rule, but moving towards independence. And this is just one of the aspect of basically allowing the Philippines to have their own defense force, still under the Americans. And of course, the second Philippine group will be the Philippine Scouts. So moving on, the status of the Philippine Scouts compared to even just the U.S. regular army they're considered as the supreme fighting force because they were well trained and well adapted to combat since 1899, and they're basically MacArthur's force because if anyone doesn't know, MacArthur is actually part of the Philippine Scouts. He was a brigadier commander of one of the brigade in 1923, before he actually presided the court-martial of the Filipinos who ended up striking just because of the pay. But of course, MacArthur ended up becoming the commander of USAPE, which is basically a force in the Philippines and also in defense of the Pacific region. Again, the Philippine Scouts considered as the backbone, and as I pointed out, MacArthur depended on the Philippine Scouts. He actually removed them from the general USAPE and put them on reserve. So that what that means is that they would deploy Philippine Army infantry groups, or even the regular army meaning the Americans, would be deployed, and then if they're struggling to secure or to defend their sections, the Philippine Scouts will be sent there. So they're basically the reserve in which they were in the middle and then waiting for anyone that needs reinforcement. That's how MacArthur depended on the Philippine Scouts. Even though they have outdated weaponry, outdated equipment, but their training basically made them indispensable during the war. And as you can see, 3 of them were awarded the first World War II Medal of Honor. One is Lieutenant Nininger, Sergeant Calugas, and then Lieutenant Bianchi. Both of the Americans were all killed, and Nininger actually died in January 1942 in Abukay, Bataan, and then Bianchi died in captivity. Basically, he died during the transporting of American POWs from the Philippines to to Japan via hell ships. And we're still looking for both of them. And then Sergeant Calugas, he's the only surviving member of these recipients, and this is. So, right after USAPE surrendered in 1942, May of 1942, the Japanese didn't really anticipate that there's going to be a lot of people who would be surrendering. They just assumed that that they would just die or commit suicide rather than be captured. But that's not the case. There were thousands and thousands of Filipinos and Americans who were captured, and the Japanese ended up trying to figure out what to do with them. So they were forced to do this death march heading to Capas. So this is the Bataan Peninsula, this area, and then they had to walk all the way to San Fernando, Pampanga, 65 miles, and then take a train and then walk all the way to Campo Dono. Along this route right here, a lot of people, a lot of soldiers ended up dying just because they were sick, or the Japanese ended up finding materials like anything, Japanese coin, Japanese, paper pan, anything with made in Japan, they were immediately executed, no questions asked. And one thing is, the Japanese did not want Filipinos and Americans to properly bury their comrades. They were supposed to leave them behind on the road. And so what happened, the Filipinos, the locals or the residents ended up burying them. And that caused problem to us, meaning the researchers looking for them. Because now we have no records of where they were buried, or most of the time, because the families or local residents would just basically try to hide the bodies, bury them in their backyard, under their house, under somewhere else, without letting the Japanese know, because they didn't want the Japanese to focus on them and ended up consider them collaborators or anything. And so along this route, there were several isolated graves, and I ended up investigating one of them in this area right here. Ended up talking to family because we believe that there's somebody or more than one buried underneath somebody's outhouse. Outhouse is like a detached bathroom. And so Campo Dono, this is the one that they ended up. It's basically a temporary barracks. So no, it's not a facility that's gonna hold thousands and thousands of people, but that's where they ended up going. And this is the situation in Campo Dono. This is basically the Filipino barracks. So you can see there's nothing there. It's just a platform. A lot of no running water. They only have, I think, one faucet somewhere, and you're looking at like thousands of people waiting for that faucet. So a lot of POWs ended up dying here, and by the thousand. And so the Filipinos and the Americans were separated. So the Americans, they have their area, and the Filipinos, they have their area. The Japanese did not, they didn't remove the distinguish Philippine Scouts from the rest of the Philippine Army. So the Philippine Scouts, Filipinos, were also part of the Filipino section. So when they ended up dying and buried, they were mixed with other Philippine Army enlisted men. There's no record keeping. They weren't that conscious of making sure how many people were buried in each of the graves. Unlike the Americans, because they have what is called the American Graves Registration Service, which is a unit that is specifically tasked to keep track of how many died, where they're buried, how many are buried in each of the plots. The Filipinos did not have that. They ended up, because they have so many people dying, and when I say that at least 100 or 200 people a day, and they're being buried or they were left somewhere else because the people who's burying them, they're also sick. So sometimes the actual people doing the burying would end up dying right there. So he would be part of the, he would end up in the grave he's digging. that's how bad the situation in Camp O'Donnell. And this is what a burial detail looks like at Camp O'Donnell. So those are, basically they're running out of space. So they were buried anywhere they can find a place. And if the GRS or the graves registration, they would end up keeping track of them, but sometimes they just couldn't. So without names, just numbers. 10 there, 15 there, 14 there, have no idea who they were, no idea of ranks, units, nothing. And you're just hoping that eventually they will be recovered. But you know, as I showed you before, right after the surrender, the Japanese took over and they're not allowed to recover the remains. So just giving you like a very quick, I guess, introduction to the GRS. One thing that is also kind of also surprised me is that, you know, the actual mortuary services or procedures that we know or I guess familiar about started in the Philippines by this individual U.S. chaplain, just tracking down, making sure that you have records of people being buried. So he kind of started the guidelines of the GRS, but again, it's not commonly adopted until later on. So he just needed some kind of, you know, logistical way to track down individuals. And yeah, this is the one that when it was activated, it's very late. So then they're working on, or they have personnel that were not trained properly. They have no idea what they're doing, especially when you're dealing with tropical climates. There's, you know, you cannot just leave the remains there for so many days. And also even the burial sites, they get flooded, so damp, a lot of problems in terms of dealing with tropical climate. So you're dealing with a lot of individuals doing this, not properly trained, they have no equipment, and many of them, they ended up depending on local residents to help them out, which is also not trained. So sometimes they would not track down, or keep track of the people that they're burying. They did try here in Bataan. The GRS officer would basically keep track of or have records, and when the USAPE force was about to surrender, this individual ended up saving those records and then transporting them to Corregidor, because you need those records. You need to be able to protect them. And these are just the example of where those cemeteries, temporary cemeteries, and they kept the records of those. Unfortunately, they did not survive the records, which I will talk briefly later. So I've already talked about majority of them, or many of these challenges. These are the common challenges that the GRS encountered when trying to find, search, identify remains of Americans and Philippine Scouts. So yeah, proper training, there's no policy. The only time they actually ended up having a guideline was by the end of the war. By that time, it's too late. Inadequate GRS personnel and proper training, again, I've already mentioned. I want to focus on the loss of burial records. This is where we're actually struggling currently. Because I mentioned before that the GRS officer who's basically trying to protect the records, the burial records that he and his men kept, when they moved to Corregidor, again because the Japanese were moving from the north, pushing down. This officer so desperately tried to save the records, he ended up hiding the records. If you're familiar with Corregidor Island, which is a fortress island in Manila Bay, it's a fortification. There's a tunnel there with several lateral tunnels going, and that particular officer decided to hide the records in one of the tunnels. Right here. So this is the tunnel, and he ended up hiding it in this one of the lateral area, hoping that they will be able to return immediately and retrieve the documents. Unfortunately, that was not the case. The Japanese bombed the whole thing, and nothing was left. And so eventually at the end of the war, what the Americans ended up doing was trying to find survivors and then getting as much information from them as they could, because there's no way that they could retrieve those documents anymore. They were destroyed, completely destroyed. And some of the records, I guess some of the records that they ended up using, or surviving records during this time, mostly the chaplains who were presiding over the burials, they're the ones who ended up just taking over the task of note-taking. So they would just grab any piece of paper and then write down the name, the date and hour, and which plot. And the way that the chaplains ended up saving those records, their own records, not the GRS records, saving those records was basically hiding them in their body, and then once they ended up at one of the POW camps, they told maybe 4 or 5 people where they're gonna bury them, hoping that those 4 people would survive the war. So in some cases, luckily some of them survived and after the war retrieved the documents, but there are also other cases that none of them survived, and we have no idea where those documents are. They're still buried somewhere in one of the camps, particularly Cabanatuan POW camp. So moving on to, I think I covered, yeah. So also another thing that is a common challenge faced by GRS is basically the search and recovery areas. They were expanded to beyond the battlefields. After the surrender in May 1942, as I mentioned before, the Japanese refused to allow the Americans and the Filipinos to retrieve the remains of their comrades. They were left there until the end of the war. On top of that, because many of them ended up, one of the things that I forgot to mention, when the Americans and the Filipinos ended up at the temporary camp, Camp O'Donnell, the Americans ended up staying there, the Americans were kept as POWs, but the Filipinos, both the Philippine Army enlisted, as well as the Philippine Scouts Filipinos, they were allowed to leave the camp. But they have to promise to the Japanese that they're not gonna be joining a guerrilla fight to oust the Japanese. So anyone who was lucky enough to survive that ordeal, they were allowed to go home. make sure that you do not bother the Japanese, will let you leave whatever. Of course, majority of the Filipino scouts ended up, the moment that they left that camp, they immediately joined the guerrilla movement. You're trained to fight. And so that complicated the situation even further, because now we're talking about battlefields. We're also now talking about POW camps. Many of them ended up dying in POW camps. We're talking about isolated graves now because of the guerrilla movements, because they would move somewhere, everywhere, jungles, mountains, you name it. And we have we don't have a lot of records of where they died, where they're buried. So I ended up basically grabbing as much as I can in terms of finding diaries, unpublished memoirs. If they mention a name, I don't care, I'm just so happy. Because then I can kind of, I know where to start. Or I can just follow whoever or try to identify those people with that particular person and try to track them down if they ended up saving their own memoirs. It's the only way to find information, especially about enlisted individual, because they're not usually there on military or official records. You will only hear about officers, when they're talking about enlisted men, private, or even non-commissioned officers, they're usually numbers. And for me, that's the only way for me to be able to find information about them, the enlisted ones. If I go through diaries or anything that would mention a name, and be able to say, okay, he's still alive on that day. Now, where the hell is he? And I would end up going to different available rosters and available anything just to find that individual. Even the official records I found, they're not very reliable, because sometimes even on the website, our website, or even the military website with the cemeteries, they would say, okay, he's from this particular unit. And sometimes I would find that no, he's not. So we're looking at the wrong location. Because if you ended up identifying the unit, then you can track down their movement. But if you identify the wrong unit, you're following the wrong, the wrong area, or looking at the wrong area. That is also a common challenge in terms of you have to make sure that you have the right unit so you can identify where they are. Another complication is like if that person decided, you know what, screw this war, I'm leaving, off I go. And you have no idea where they are. And they would often be recorded, their status as MIA. Right after the fall of Bataan and Corregidor in 42, they're gone. You have no idea where they are. And so my job would be just basically going through all the rosters, and I said going through diaries, and sometimes many of them ended up joining the unit that is still there in the south, Mindanao. That's the one that is basically were kept intact because they were far from Bataan, which is the main area, and so they're the ones who actually refused to surrender. They were told to please surrender, otherwise the people in Bataan and Corridor will be killed. So they had to surrender. And many of the ones who did not want to surrender in Bataan ended up going to Mindanao. And so some of them I did find that they were there. From there, again, nobody knows. In terms of the unique challenges, when dealing with the Philippine Scouts, I've already mentioned that the Japanese did not, they didn't find any distinction between Filipinos of the Philippine Scouts and Filipinos of the Philippine Army. They're all Filipinos. And so the Americans also do that, or did that at that time. That as much as I pointed out before that, the Philippine Scouts or members of the Philippine Scouts should be considered or were considered as part of the U.S. regular army with all the benefits and everything, but there's still a discrepancy in terms of their treatment. And then another, I'm sorry, I've already mentioned that the available records mentioned before, enlisted men did not really show up in records, and that would also be with the Philippine Scouts as well as the other units. And with the guerrilla records also, the guerrilla records, because many of them were organized by Philippine Scouts, particularly American officers. They're the ones who started various units. And then after they were captured, the record keeping kind of stopped or very limited. And again, that means that the other enlisted Philippine Scouts in those involved in those units, they don't register. Another thing is this insufficient post-war investigative effort by GRS. We usually, an individual, if they're deceased, a file is created for each of those individuals. It's called IDPF, Individual Personal Deceased File. All the reports, letters, inquiries were put in those files. Now, for what I'm going through Filipino or Philippine Scout files, they're very, very thin, because the only investigation that GRS personnel ended up doing was going to, if, for example, that person, the deceased individual died and had a family. The only investigation that the GRS ended up doing was basically talking to the widow and asked her, did you know anything? What do you expect she's gonna say? And then she would end up telling the investigators, oh, you should talk to this individual, because I think I know, or they were with him when he ended up joining the guerrilla. They had this information, it was there, like, because the files would have the letters of the widow or family members or a cousin or whatever, and they would have names telling them you should contact these people. No. One is possibly, because they're dealing with so many people to look for. I can understand that. You only have one thing. The one thing too is, like, after the war, when the GRS ended up formally able to do their work, the other thing that they had to also contend with is the part where the issue of the Philippines is the Americans is actually giving the Philippines independence, 1946. That means that the time of the GRS in their search and recovery operations were limited. They have to be out of there, stop their operations by 1948, the latest, early 1949. So if you're dealing with searching for a lot of people since 1941, and you have 3, maybe 4 years to do it, it has to be very, very fast. And unfortunately, that's what happened with, particularly with the cases of the Philippine Scouts. The GRS ended up, we've done an investigation, close, non-recovered let's move on to the next one. Unrecovered, let's move on. And that's also what they ended up doing with, of course, in the case of American enlisted men. If they had no, they couldn't be found in rosters, nobody could remember where they were, automatically the administrative death date or the administrative status for that individual will be MIA since Corregidor. MIA since 1945. That's it, nothing else. And then GRS would immediately recommend to the Army, saying, we can't find any evidence, we can't find any records. Let's just, they're not closing the case, they're just stating that this person should be deemed or declared non-recoverable. That's it. And many of these individuals, including the Philippine Scouts, that's their status since 1949, non-recoverable. With this particular agency that I'm supporting, they basically kind of took the baton a little too late, 3 years, 30 years, 40 years after the fact, and trying to kind of make sense of what's available and what was done before, and hopefully be able to make a difference and try to find as many as we can. But we're dealing with decades of, there already a lot of them, especially when we're dealing with, places that were with reconstruction happening after the war, a lot of them bulldozed, a lot of them with a lot of structures, buildings, washed away by floods, you name it. And like I mentioned before, it's like some of them we kind of consider, okay, we have to figure out that there's somebody buried under, I think currently we're working on somebody's buried under a bus stop, but how do you tell the government, can we destroy the bus stop so we can dig underneath? There's a lot of planning and a lot of actual research to make a case that there's somebody down there that we need to recover, and that takes time. With the interview, we actually, I think I guess I'm lucky enough that I'm a Philippine-born historian, because I was able to accompany our investigative team to talk to people. So I'm doing the historian / archaeologist, sociologist in one. I guess also linguist maybe, because I ended up talking to many of the I guess residents, because it's just so weird to just approach somebody and ask them, do you know anyone who died or buried during the war? You get, what the hell? But then they would end up basically talking about, oh, I heard that my grandfather said, or we believe that there's somebody buried there, but most of the time, surprisingly, they ended up telling me, like, okay, here is Mary, ended up telling me about ghost stories, because that's how, if you're aware, you're familiar with oral history, either you tell them by rumors, urban legends, or you tell them by ghost stories, that somebody's coming out of that area, or we see shadows from that place, and I ended up actually getting several stories like those, especially the case about the Bataan Death March case, that actually when I talked to them, that was just a very lucky break, because I ended up picking the right person to interview first. Because one of the things that I was working on, just trying to find this the grave, one of the isolated grave, is just a sketch map with an X. No name of the street, no idea which part of the town, but it's in this particular town with an X. And so the one person I interviewed in it first said, do you know the property of, oh sorry, I forgot that it has the name of the individual who owned that property, but who do you know, like, would somebody remember who lives there in 1940? Luckily, he did, the person I interviewed. Actually, the person I interviewed happened to be his relative. And then he said, initially he was very confused and very suspicious, because why are you asking me this? And then he thought that I was looking for Yamashita's treasure. That's the thing in the Philippines. The also thing is that if you started asking for anything about World War II, their initial reaction will be, are you looking for Yamashita's treasure, and did you find it? And that's why the person I interviewed, he was very suspicious, but I said, like, no, I'm looking for an individual and I can prove it. I gave him a copy of the sketch and all the documentation, and that's when he knew that I was actually doing research and I'm finding treasure. After he saw it, he's like, oh yeah, I know that property is just right across the street. And so he took me to that property and then said, you gotta talk to this person, tell her everything, Of course, the people there, the original owner already passed. They have no idea what's happening or what happened during that time. Their father refused to talk about that time, because that was the street where all those men walked, that route. He did not want to say anything to his children about it. But what they told me, actually, they said, actually, we have something to tell you. It's about this ghost. Then they described this person. This ghost actually came out of that outhouse, walking to the street, and then going back. Like, okay. Can you show me where the location is? I have the sketch map, but I didn't show them where the sketch map, or what's on that map. And then they walked me to that location, and all I could say is, oh my God, because it's like, because the sketch map only says like an actual house, and then the position of the house, and then the position of the X from the street, and it kind of matched. So I was very excited inside, but also very weirded out. But I think that's also the reason why they're so open to tell me about the ghost, because I guess they know that I would understand. I'm not gonna basically, say that's not real, because as a Catholic country, we were so used to ghost stories in terms of souls that are that's still seeking out a way to go to be able to get home, and so and I think that was the case with that one, why they were so, I guess, open to tell me that particular story. I don't know. I'm not suggesting that is another option of research approach, but whatever works. You can consider that as an oral history project or tradition.
Well, don't leave us hanging. Did you find a skeleton in that site?
Actually, the last time we were there in 2019, we were already scouting the location, and then when we were there in 2019, I actually have a team that they ended up talking to other families sorry, just to make sure that we're not gonna be just excavating somebody's bathroom. But we didn't have a chance yet to go back, but we are already trying to figure out how we're gonna do it, because otherwise, well, one is you're dealing with the bathroom itself, but at the same time, I'm talking about the location where the Mount Pinatubo erupted. So we're also dealing with at least 12 feet of lahar, concrete. So there's no way we're gonna be we're gonna go dig through and find nobody. So I don't know what they're still considering in terms of using sonar just to figure out if there's actually that's work, but we're still working on that particular case.
Thank you.
And hopefully the next time we go back, which is next year, we'll be able to go back to that particular case and figure out what we're gonna do to check under. And then last but not the least, in all of the cases that we deal or handle, in order for that particular case to proceed, we need to be able to collect DNA samples from family members so that we can compare. Their DNAs, because once we recover the remains, they need to be checked. And that's where also our major problem when dealing with Philippine Scouts, because, well, you know, Filipinos, after the war, we basically moved all over the place. So the enormous task of doing a massive genealogical project and tracking each and every family member that we can get to. The thing is, like, we need a specific line of family. We cannot just get DNA from everyone. There's a specific line of family where we need a specific DNA. So that is the one that's kind of also making it difficult for us to proceed when we're dealing now with Filipinos, is just being able to get the DNA that we need. Because let's say, for example, if we're dealing with one common grave with 10 remains, 10 sets of remains, we need at least 60% of the DNAs collected before we can proceed. So, for example, if let's say we found 5 families, that's not going anywhere. We still need that one. And so whenever we meet with families, because that's what we do also, we give them updates. So every year we have 4 meetings with family members who wanted to ask about their loved ones. And I ended up meeting some of them, because when we do the updates, we will tell them how many we've already collected. And sometimes, like, we would say, we just need 1. And they're the ones who's actually so desperate that they would say, give me the name and I will find them. I will find the families. Because that's just 1 holding you up before proceeding. And with Philippine Scouts, that is unfortunately the case. That's why there's a little bit of reluctance to proceed, because you're gonna be dealing with a massive project. And with that said, in closing, as you can see, this is a massive project looking for 70,000, only 11,000 people, with 4,000 Filipinos. The main problem, or the uniqueness of this particular case with the Philippine Scouts basically stems from the nature of the Philippine Scouts. Because they're Filipinos, never mind, you know, the obvious reason, the obvious part of it, but it's also just the enormity of finding them, not just the actual individuals, but finding families that we can get DNA from. And so, you know, it's a massive undertaking. Sorry, I have to go immediately. But these are just the names. As you can see, like all of these tablets are, you know, with names up still unaccounted. And that particular number here usually changes. Like the one that I mentioned is like we're into 4,300. This is the one that is right now listed among this. Again, it's like just because of the records. We're trying to fix or make sure to have more accurate data. So we're gathering, okay, this person is actually Philippine Scouts, and we're counting them. But there are still names here that are, you know, and these also are names not just from the Philippines, but also Papua New Guinea, New Guinea, and other areas in the Pacific. So, anyway, with that said, just want to make sure that you know the numbers that I'm working on. Thank you so much for your attention, and have a good night.